Welcome to the Earthworks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining another Earthworks podcast. I'm Kevin Hicks, and I'm excited to have Claire Phillips on, who is a PhD research scientist with, I've got my notes here that she sent me, with the USDA, the Ag Research Service. She recently gave a talk. You can kind of get into some of the details with that, Claire, but thanks for joining me. She recently did a talk for a superintendent group in our area in the Northwest on carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions. And you know, we kind of play around the edges in our field, but it's been a question of mine, both in turf and also in my service as a soil conservation manager or board member here in our county. How do we tie some of the work that's being done at the federal level with what we do in the turfgrass world? And you're the first one that's really kind of bridged that for me. And it's been kind of a long time coming, Claire, to get you on the podcast between scheduling and holiday breaks and that kind of stuff. But thanks for joining us, and thanks for sharing your presentation with me. So I kind of created some bullet points, but let's start by just kind of telling us a little bit about your background, where you're, where you got your start, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I'm really happy to be here. I've been working in soil carbon for a long time. I started my PhD in 2005, measuring CO2 emissions from soil. So I've been doing this for a while, and have worked in forests and more natural grasslands and ag systems. I've been working with the Agricultural Research Service since 2013. And the way this project came about was, let's see, we started this in 2019 or so. So I was stationed in Corvallis. I worked for the branch of the Ag Research Service that was working with the turfgrass industry. And we were getting interest from grass seed producers in having us do research on carbon, because the Oregon state legislature at that time was debating a cap and trade program, which ultimately failed, and they still don't have a program. But the grass seed industry said, we have perennial grasses. It doesn't really get much better than that for carbon sequestration when you're talking about field crops. And so just kind of alongside that, we started having conversations with Alec Kowaleski at Oregon State. So he manages the turf program there. And he had interest from the Northwest Turf Association also in looking at this question. And I started digging into the literature, and
took you about 10 minutes.
What?
Took you about 10 minutes to get through all the literature on this subject?
Actually, there was quite a bit of literature, and that's what got me pretty excited. Because going back to like maybe the early 90s, there were some really neat studies, and it was cool because folks all across the country, different turf programs, and also in urban ecology programs, were replicating the same experiment. And so what folks were doing were they would find, the first study was golf courses. So find golf courses of different ages and go measure the soil carbon, and then put together a time series. So we call it a chronosequence. And it showed that the older the turf was, the more carbon there was. So we put together a paper that summarized all these studies. I think there were 63 studies that we were able to summarize. And then also with support from Northwest Turf Association and a grant from the USDA Ag Marketing Service, we got some equipment to do our own measurements. And so those measurements we wrapped up just recently, I think in January, actual carbon measurements in Corvallis to characterize, our typical cool season grasses in the Northwest.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the data collection was done mostly at the Oregon State campus in Corvallis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Original data collection, but we're building on the backs of people that have been, working on this for a while. So that was fun, reaching out to turf programs all across the country and asking if we could include their data.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's stop on this for a minute, because it's something that we've wrestled with internally at our company is what can you define two questions, and you and I have talked offline about this too. Can you define what soil carbon is? In turf, we think of organic matter as carbon, but it's also undesirable in some cases. But in our conversation, it's a desirable thing, especially if it's further down the line of humification, where it's actually of value. But what is soil carbon, and how are you measuring it?
Good questions.
Will that end our hour here?
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky in such a fast growing system where you're getting this accumulation of thatch. And we've had a lot of conversations about whether that's soil or not,
Yeah.
So it is a tricky thing, but we are typically quantifying the carbon that is not in the thatch, right? Because that could decompose really quickly.
Sure.
But carbon that's in their mineral soil lasts a bit longer on timescales that have the potential to help mitigate emissions, is the thinking. So yeah, we're talking in the mineral soil, but yeah, it's tricky. And we can talk, a little bit about that. I mentioned these chronosequence studies.
Yeah.
Time zero is really different depending what setting you're in. So sometimes establishment of new turf is with seed, sometimes it's with sod, sometimes it's in a housing development where the topsoil's been removed and it's just subsoil, and sometimes it's cropland conversion. So yeah, that's a feature of the system that has to be contended with.
So what explain what you said, sequencing. What is that? What does that mean? Most of us probably don't know what that means. That's research speak that we don't talk about a whole lot. So what does that mean?
For sure. Okay, so you can imagine if you were to design the most foolproof study, you would take I don't know, a cropland or whatever your pre-turf condition is, and you would plant turf and you would follow it for the next 100 years.
Okay.
But that would take 100 years.
Okay.
So a chronosequence is you take different locations that have different age turf and you put them together.
Oh, okay.
And so you're making like a space for time substitution. You're saying all of these locations were in basically the same environment.
Right.
So they can represent what a sequence in one location, what a time series of one location would have been like.
Sure.
And it means that you could sample, let's say, a sequence of 83 years in one summer. If you just go to different locations that have turf of different ages.
That makes sense. Okay. So you're kind of filling in the gaps with different sites is basically what you're trying to do. So one of the things, so obviously the other portion of this is photosynthesis and respiration and the whole thing. So, I'm kind of bouncing around already. We're 5 minutes into this, but so how much of a role does that play? And I know you talked in your presentation with the Inland Empire group that we've got a seasonal component here where there's a portion of the year that's turf is essentially dormant. How does that play a role? Photosynthesis obviously is sequestering carbon in its natural process. So what you've got the carbon in the soil, but you've also got the metabolic functions, if you will, of the plant. So what are your findings, and what's the most important piece of the puzzle for turf managers?
Yeah, I mean, what you're bringing up is really the crux of the matter. So I'll just take a step back, and I think the simplest way to illustrate what's happening is with Yeling Chan's study. So she was the first person to do one of these chronosequence studies. And she took soil testing data from a bunch of different golf courses in Colorado area, Colorado, Wyoming.
Okay.
And she showed that as both putting greens and roughs. I think she was looking at roughs or fairways. Putting greens and fairways were getting older. They were accumulating carbon. So carbon stocks were building up. Pretty remarkable, even on a putting green, right? Since it's just a sand substrate. And eventually the carbon levels leveled off. Okay. But that initial rate of buildup, in their paper, they compared that to rates of carbon buildup that we see in some of the conservation programs that we use on farmlands.
Sure.
And so these conservation programs were like, the idea is you can take land out of production, you can allow the soil to regenerate, build up organic matter. And so we knew at that time how quickly carbon could build up, say, in the Conservation Reserve Program. That's like our premier conservation program as part of USDA conservation measures.
And I think
which takes
is it like a 20-year span? Is that what I read in your presentation?
Yeah, I think enrollments are typically 10 years or to 20 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're referring to the CRP program that's available for
CRP program.
agricultural growers. Okay.
Yeah.
So do you find that's a comparable analysis as far as, once you get to that 20-year mark, maybe it's a diminishing return, or does it continue beyond that?
Yeah. So initial carbon buildup in turfgrass was comparable to the CRP program. Like, she projected on all our irrigated turfgrass, we're probably storing carbon at a rate similar to the CRP program.
Okay.
But yeah, what happens after 20 years or 30 years? And in our analysis, we found that carbon stopped building up. It kind of reached zero gain at 50 years post-establishment. And so what is happening in terms of the biology is you're adding more carbon to the soil. The microbes are happy. Their populations build up. So that's that respiration piece, that soil respiration piece. So microbes eventually get accustomed to receiving more carbon inputs, and they have higher decomposition rates. And so eventually, after many decades, you've reached a new steady state. Decomposition rates are higher. And so there's more carbon in the soil, but you stop accumulating anymore.
Okay.
So that process, it's going to depend exactly on the system and the climate, how long that equilibration takes. But we saw an average across all the studies that we put together across the US, by 50 years, the new steady state had been reached.
So what you're suggesting then is we need to renovate our golf courses every 50 or so years to get that restarted. I know there's a lot of superintendents that are always lobbying for renovation dollars. So maybe that's their impetus, right?
It's a really good question. This is not just a feature of turfgrass, right?
Yeah.
This leveling off, it's going to be any agricultural system, any system where you're making a change in management to try and build up soil carbon. You're just going to reach a new steady state. And then what? How do you keep the soil carbon in there? What can you do to have some additional gains? These are very good questions, and I've got some answers.
So let's back to CRP for a minute. If that's a 10 to 20 year span, and I don't know the answer to this, is there a part of that program that says, okay, after let's use 20 years as the benchmark. So after 20 years, go ahead and do your conventional tillage and put that back into rotation, or has that program kind of kept going in perpetuity as well?
The CRP program still exists.
But on specific acreage, let's say we take an acreage on the Palouse of Washington, once they've fulfilled that obligation of 20 years, then do they put it back into um, crop production?
That's a good question. You know, in the last 20 years, there's been much more adoption of no-till practices on the Palouse. The stacking of conservation practices is certainly something our NRCS counterparts are always trying to promote. So coming out of CRP into conservation practices, reduced tillage, is a way of keeping as much of that carbon in the soil as possible. And remember, on the Palouse, like a lot of these things were developed to combat erosion.
Right.
So carbon kind of came along as this add-on, and I think historically really promoted by some individuals. Like Ratan Lal is a famous soil scientist who's really promoted this idea that we can sequester carbon in soils. But like no-till and CRP, especially no-till, its primary purpose, original purpose, was to stop soil erosion. Yeah.
Yeah, you and I are familiar. So for those of you that aren't from the Northwest, the Palouse area is it kind of encompasses a portion of Idaho and Washington. Beautiful rolling hills. The springtime is just, I mean, every season's beautiful, but the hills this time of year when we're getting all the rains, the hills, you can see them running off into the valleys, and it's an area of the country that should be preserved because it's really rich agricultural land, but it's also, like you said, very susceptible to erosion, and however we need to do it, I think we only get one soil, one topsoil, so we might as well try to do whatever we can to try to preserve it. So let's go back into turf then. Obviously, like you said, we've got a constant stand of turf grass, which should be an opportunity for us to take part in carbon sequestration or take advantage of that. And we're probably doing it without even realizing it in a lot of cases. How can we capitalize on that as an industry? And I didn't have this as a bullet point, but it's really kind of the bottom line question is, your research, others' research has shown that we're doing this. So how do we get credit for it? How do we, really try to toot our horns?
Yeah, great question. And the way I look at it is we're talking about carbon. The carbon is kind of how you get people in the door. And then we really need to be talking about some other things. We need to be talking about nitrogen. We need to be talking about irrigation. We need to be talking about biodiversity. And yeah, I mean, this kind of what you described of like the carbon only builds up for a certain amount of time, and then what? Well, then what happens is our ecosystems, our turf ecosystems, our agricultural ecosystems, they become emission sources. And that comes a lot from nitrogen application, because the other main greenhouse gas that we're talking about in these systems is nitrous oxide, N2O.
Sure. Yep.
Right. And so that is comes along with nitrogen fertilization. Soil microbes convert some of that available nitrogen into N2O, which is an ozone depleter and a greenhouse gas. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think what everything boils down to, what we can do to fight climate change, is grow as much as possible with as few synthetic inputs and as little water as possible.
Yeah.
That's our job.
Well, and I think, we certainly have some anecdotal research in our business in doing just that, and they all play a role in the same goal, right? I mean, if you're you're reducing your inputs and getting soil biology working the way it needs to, and lowering our synthetic inputs at the same time, which we typically see with some of our products, is it's a terrible marketing strategy, but it's a really good environmental story, is we tend to see our customers' inputs go down. And I think it's because of what you're highlighting here. You're letting the system kind of run itself at that point versus just having your thumb on the or your foot on the gas all the time. We don't know how to study it, but but we hear those reports a lot that, and I don't think it's product specific. I just think that you're getting the system. I always say, would you rather have your soil work for you or you work for your soil? And I think that's a pretty all-encompassing sort of statement, but it's also very difficult to attain. And you've got to be looking at all those different prongs of the issue to really achieve that. So you still haven't answered how we measure carbon, and I really want to kind of dive into that a little bit, because I think it's, if we want to try to talk about it as an industry, we have to know how to quantify it. So tell me what measures you're using, what can the average turf manager then use on his or her individual property to be able to quantify some of what's going on?
It's a big question. The whole world is talking right now about how to measure carbon change.
Right.
There's a whole industry around it. So,
and a lot of money.
yeah.
And a lot of research dollars.
A lot of investments are being made in trying to monitor carbon change. So we can start at the shortest time scale, which is a plant gets sunlight on it, it starts immediately taking up CO2. And also releasing CO2, right? Because it has to respire to live, and the soil is respiring. So one way of measuring carbon change is CO2 flux. And we do that. We can use chambers, although a chamber will cover an area like this. It's very small. We measure carbon flux using micrometeorology techniques. So that can measure CO2 exchange and other gases like N2O at maybe a couple acre scale.
Okay.
And again, that's instantaneous. So you got to measure CO2 exchange continuously over a whole year. And then at the end of the year, you can sum up all the fluxes from every single minute of every single day. And you can say, okay, this system either took up carbon or lost carbon. It was either a source or a sink.
Okay.
But if you're talking about longer time scales, like you want to know whether your system was a source or a sink over maybe 2 years or 5 years or a decade, then the pool that's absorbing or releasing carbon is basically your soil. Your plants turn over every year. Their height, they're not really, it's not a forest growing. We're talking about turf that's about the same amount of biomass every year, and the thatch pool is growing. So there's some buildup there, but mostly your tank that's storing carbon is soil.
Yeah.
So that means you can just take soil carbon inventories every 5 years or every 10 years. If you take it more frequently, the change might be lost in the noise, because it's also pretty spatially variable.
Yeah.
But every 5 to say 10 years, there's going to be enough of a buildup to measure the change. So those are direct measurements. And what the carbon market companies are doing in the agricultural sector is mainly focusing actually on simulations of models of carbon change, based on the last 50 years of research where they've built cropping system models based on data, and now they can just simulate, okay, what crop is being grown, what are the farming practices, and so forth. So I don't think those really exist for turf, but they may be in development. And And then there's also companies developing remote sensing techniques, and proximal sensing means like proximate to your measurement, right? So you sent me a link to a company called Yardstick.
Yeah.
So the technology they're developing is to put a probe in the ground. It simultaneously will measure how dense the soil is, based on how difficult it is to push the probe in. And then it'll also, using spectroscopy, get a measure of how much carbon, like the carbon concentration as it's moving through the soil.
Okay.
So I don't think it's at a commercial stage yet. I think it's pre-commercial.
I think that was kind of a like a, whatever they call that, like a crowdsourcing. What do they call that? Kickstarter. I think that was a Kickstarter campaign. But our lab, the lab that we work with, Logan Labs in Ohio, has been looking at this very thing. And again, they're trying to figure out, okay, is it, you've mentioned ambient carbon measurements, you've mentioned soil carbon measurements. Where's the most value? Where should we be focusing our attention? If a golf course superintendent is interested in diving into this, it sounds like soil is the longer term value. Is that, am I reading you right on that, or not necessarily?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of folks are already doing soil testing, right? And
so is it organic matter testing, like on a traditional?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I mean, one step, so when you send your sample in to a testing lab, a lot of testing labs do loss on ignition, which means they just burn up the soil, and then whatever is left is considered to be the mineral part.
Correct.
And what burned off is the organic matter. And that's fine. It's a bit more reliable to ask for a direct measurement of carbon content with a elemental analyzer. But yeah, to get in the door, loss on ignition with your standard soil test package is certainly going to give you good information. And then, you might be mostly interested in the fertility in the top 6 inches or foot. For really good carbon measurements, carbon markets are trading on the top 30 centimeters.
Right.
I work on the Palouse. We always sample the 5 feet because our soils are deep.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of action going on there, and the roots are down there.
But you still do it, I assume, in horizons, right? Maybe, are they 1 foot horizons?
1 foot increments. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I think it's probably more typical in golf to, number one, more modern golf courses have been given some of the crummiest soil in the country to work with. And like you said, the topsoil has been removed and probably sold or something along the lines. And honestly, at a 1/10 or even a 1/2 of an inch of growing height, you're not going to produce some of the root systems you see on the Palouse, where you've got a regenerative farmer that's got the same cover crop in the field for years and years and years. I mean, between legumes and all the other stuff that they grow in those cover crops, they're deeply rooted systems. So yeah, I could see where you would want to look at a deeper horizon than we would. So then, okay, so if loss on ignition measurement is a fair start, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think
no, that's fine. I'll go with that.
So if that's a fair start, because I think that's probably the most common way that turf managers look at organic matter, or look at carbon in this case. And I think, to me, it's I don't feel like we've got a great tool to measure carbon separate from organic matter, because, and this is the point I was going to try to get to, because I think a lot of turf managers consider rising organic matter numbers to be a bad thing. And there's researchers in our field that think that's a bad thing. It may be, and it may not be, depending on, and I think one of the things that we're trying to get our heads wrapped around is, how do we jump from loss on ignition measurements to some sort of a humification type of process where it's turning into a carbon that's useful in this conversation? I don't know that it's out there, and you probably know more than I do in that regard. But I think that's kind of the next step in the evolution of monitoring for turf managers and trying to get good data that they can start a conversation with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm a turf outsider, so
But you're not though, Claire. That was the thing that struck me is there's a lot of researchers that maybe have driven by a golf course, but you can talk the talk more than most. And so, and I don't want you to fill in the blanks for me, but that's what really impressed me about your talk is I looked at somebody sitting next to me. I said, she's actually been on a golf course and understands how that process works. And it's pretty rare.
Well, I'm excited for you and for like the folks that I was talking with at the golf course superintendent's meeting in Spokane. Like after I gave my talk, people were coming up to me just to share a wide variety of conservation practices that
Right.
they have started doing on their golf courses.
Yeah.
And they stemmed from monitoring soil moisture
Mm-hmm.
to for irrigation management to zoning nitrogen applications.
Sure.
So and compost additions, just a whole variety of things. And that kind of echoed some other things I've heard, like I go to the agronomy society's meetings, and I presented this work in an urban soils session. I didn't present it in the turf session because
Okay.
I'm a soil scientist. So
Sure.
um and and somebody came up to me and was like, we should have more turf people in the urban soil session or in the urban sessions, right?
Right.
Because then you get kind of just cued into folks that are thinking more about greening the urban environment and whole ecosystem approaches. And, it's just not as focused on inputs and pesticide management and stuff like that. So I I have heard golf course superintendents kind of like really wanting to focus on soil health, and um I don't know, they come up to me like I'm a person who might appreciate that emphasis. And I
Right.
think this kind of echoes this broader movement that's happening, which is there have been a lot of investments in soil carbon sequestration, and it is just a gateway to
Right.
managing soils,
Right.
to managing
Absolutely.
soil health, to conserving soils. And when you start to adapt, when you start to adopt that mindset, then all of a sudden you're not just growing a crop or growing grass, you're actually growing soil. And it gets pretty exciting.
Well, and you're contributing to not only your environment and your ecosystem, but you're contributing to your community. And I think there has been some research, but quite honestly, we don't see too many folks from the four-letter agencies that
Mhm.
either A, understand or B, appreciate some of the work that's being done in our field. And there's a lot of folks in turf management that are pretty passionate about it. And that's
Mhm.
what drives
Right.
me. And that's what drove me as a golf course superintendent was trying to do things better. Um, but we don't talk about it enough. So having somebody like yourself who's bridging that gap, I'm sure that's why they came up to you because they recognize that, gosh, you're somebody who might actually listen to what we have to say and yet somehow introduce us to a larger audience. I think it's great.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited for these conversations, these soil health
Yeah.
conversations, these like let's talk about what we can do to increase our ecosystem services. That's pretty cool.
The tricky thing for a lot of us in the industry, because we've got pressures, superintendents especially have pressures on
Yeah.
them that are it's part of the job and we understand that, but uh some of the slides in your slide set you talked about steps or things that we can do to try to not only build but increase? Build and increase are kind of the same thing, but to help with regard to carbon sequestration. Just a couple of the ones that I wrote down: reduce or returning clippings, managing practices that improve sequestration, verticutting and aeration, which kind of came to mind when you talked about those systems as they age. There's a diminishing return on the ability of a soil to sequester carbon. Does aerification maybe have a place in, obviously we're increasing oxygen. So my mind goes right to, well, for increasing oxygen, we're increasing, or we're creating an environment that's more conducive to good biological activity. So does that kind of kickstart that, jumpstart that process again?
Yeah. So aeration and that
Verticutting?
other word, verticutting. Anytime you're disturbing the soil, you're going to remove carbon and you're going to promote decomposition. And same I work now in ag systems. Occasional tillage is a really important tool, and
Yeah.
occasional tillage probably does cause a carbon loss. But soil management is not about entombing carbon in soil. I mean, if you were just trying to do that, you would have a dead soil.
Yeah,
That's not
I
what we're
really
trying
like
to
how
do.
you put that too, entombing carbon. That's a really good, because it's a
Yeah.
living, breathing dynamic system, right?
Yeah. So one of my favorite quotes, quasi quotes from Ratan Lal is, soils are the only place where death gives way to new life.
Mm-hmm.
And
Love
so
that.
what functioning soils are doing is decomposing organic matter and providing nutrients to support new plant growth.
Right.
And soils have to be alive to do that. And microbes have to be able to do the job of breaking down old material, and they need oxygen to do that. And so, sustaining that living system will mean that you can't get to maybe some theoretical maximum amount of carbon storage. If you're keeping the microbes alive, then they will continue their cycling.
Right.
And, when I'm imagining a listener saying, but if you keep bringing compost, and then you'll be building up the soil and you'll be adding organic matter and so forth. It's true, but that has to come from someplace else.
Yeah.
So so your question a few minutes ago is, what can turf grass managers do to increase carbon sequestration? So nitrogen is one that we were thinking a lot about. And our question was, we know nitrogen leads to N2O emissions, and those N2O emissions, you can see them as like offsetting the benefits you got from carbon sequestration.
Is that regardless of source?
Well, it takes energy to make synthetic fertilizer. Yeah. So if there are locally sourced biosolids or compost, you could probably reduce the emissions associated with your nitrogen fertilizer. It doesn't matter what source it is as far as what the microbes do, and they will convert any source to N2O.
Thank you. I've been saying that forever, and we have these micro arguments about, oh, this source of N is better than this source. No, it's all broken down by the same process to make it plant available. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. So the only way you can reduce N2O emissions is to not have a lot of excess nitrogen.
Yeah.
So that gets into your 4R nitrogen management.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So then you're right. So to maximize the carbon gains, you got to do your 4R nitrogen management. And water has an energy footprint too.
Mm-hmm.
especially if it's treated water that is being used for irrigation. So water management too. So it's like right grass cultivars. And I'm pretty excited about the breeding efforts that are going on for better water use efficiency and not requiring as much nitrogen. Yeah. And then I hear that humic products also can have some benefits for drought adaptation
Yeah.
too.
I mean,
Mhm.
there's some research, and I can't remember who I read this, who had published this, but it was in a really interesting book that talked about organic matter specifically, but probably not specifically at the same time based on our conversation, and its ability, it's just its raw ability to hold moisture in the soil. And I believe the number was for every 1% of organic matter increased, the ability for an acre was to hold an extra 25,000 gallons of water. Well, when you think about, the irrigation input that golf courses are using, especially in the Western US, that can add up. That's a fair amount of water, and maybe you're lengthening your water window, or maybe you're obviously reducing your inputs. I happen to think that turf managers are pretty darn efficient users of water, but it's also considered by the outside to be more of a luxury consumption too, because it's a recreational facility. So yeah, I think there's a lot to this, but once you kind of get everything clicking on all cylinders, the system will tend to take care of itself.
Yeah.
A
And
lot more readily anyway. It's still going to require inputs.
um an interesting development in the water aspects too is this research that's coming along with agrivoltaics. Because you think you need full sunlight to get maximum growth, but the agrivoltaics work is showing actually strategic shading reduces water stress,
Sure.
and can enhance growth. And so I know that turf managers don't like trees.
See, you do know us.
But strategic, shading,
Yeah.
can I think in the right settings could help with water management.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so too. Um, in your research, have you gotten granular enough to see whether certain species or cultivars of turfgrass are better at this, either on the respiration and photosynthesis side, or just on production of organic biomass? Are there some that
Yeah.
we should be looking towards? Breeding obviously is
Yeah.
kind of a separate issue, but I'm just
Yeah.
curious.
So our research ended up being mostly cool season grasses is
Right.
what came up in the data set. So warm season grasses are definitely going to be more water efficient. And what we can see from our measurements in Corvallis, our direct measurements, was, whoa, these plants are super active in January and February. And so that was a really neat thing to realize too, that the cool season grasses are growing when nothing else is growing,
Yeah.
and providing that winter carbon sink. And that's something I've heard at meetings I've been to. There's carbon measurements on golf courses in the Indianapolis area, and they made the same remark that they were really surprised to see how big the carbon fluxes were, and especially in the shoulder seasons. I don't think they're getting dead of winter growth, but those
Right.
cool season grasses in the fall and the spring are really advantageous too, right? Able to use as soon as it warms up enough, they're
Yeah.
going.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
And that's an area of the country where Indianapolis and a little further south, where the ebb and flow of warm to cool season grasses seems to be a cyclical type of thing, where maybe the Bermuda grasses or zoysia grasses tend to push a little further north for a while, and then breeding of the cool season pushes the warm seasons further south. I've been in the industry almost 40 years, and it's a cyclical thing that we see, especially mid-Atlantic. the transition zone where these the push between warm and cool season grasses kind of goes back and forth. And based on the conversation, it may or may not be the most advantageous thing from this conversation as far as carbon sequestration. I mean, there's also a survival mechanism where, I think some of that's being pushed by the fact that it just becomes too difficult either to manage one or the other. And so they tend to adopt that. But warm season, obviously, when they're rolling, are far more efficient at this than cool season. Is that kind of what I'm reading?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. More water efficient. And yeah, and just speaking from my perspective of working with wheat growers in the Palouse,
Sure.
some of the growers are using biologicals like mycorrhizae, and I wonder about like mycorrhizae, we know from research helps with phosphorus,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not something that helps with like nitrogen.
Right.
But in terms of overall improvement of plant health and ability to withstand stress, I think those kind of things that come around the edges and help with overall plant management are going to help generally with water stress and nitrogen stress when you're talking about reducing those inputs.
Yeah, no doubt. We've got good research on mycorrhiza with water management or water efficiency. So,
Yeah.
there's some definite benefit to that. And I work in some areas that phosphorus restrictions are becoming more prevalent, or phosphorus bans.
Yeah.
That's where I think things like mycorrhiza could play a really important role in, because there is phosphorus in soils. Obviously, we tend to be in the West a little higher pH, so tie up is a much more prevalent issue. So can we use those things to try to tap into that reserve that we've got that may be largely unavailable? That's a whole nother
I'm glad
subject.
you mentioned pH too, because that's another thing coming around the edges, making sure pH is managed,
Right.
and that will improve nitrogen utilization efficiency.
Yep.
And then you don't have to apply as much nitrogen.
All fertility, really. Right.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
And
So go ahead.
Carbonate. So folks in arid areas may have carbonates in their soil, caliche layers. That's like a carbonate hard pan. And that's carbon too. When we're talking about soil carbon sequestration, we're talking about building up organic matter, but certainly we don't want to lose those carbonate layers. They will become CO2. And so that's something that what can we do about that? We appropriate pH management, not allowing soils to become really acidic due to nitrogen fertilizer applications certainly helps with that. So I just wanted to mention that too.
Sure. Well, good segue, because my last bullet point, as I'm looking at the clock saying, okay, well, we're almost to an hour. As I warned you, it would go pretty quickly. One of the things that you had a couple slides that you mentioned, and it's I cover the southwestern region of the states as part of my territory, and there's been a huge campaign of late regarding regional lawn removal and crediting, whether it's homeowners or golf courses or municipalities, somebody's crediting them for removing lawns. My initial thought is, and I think I'm on the right track on this, is that with this discussion in mind, that may not be our best move. Is that a fair assessment of that?
Yeah, that was something I was wondering about too, as I was putting together this review study. So the bigger picture is we have to manage the whole life cycle of a piece of turf, right? So it matters what it was before it was turf. Yes, we can say turf builds up soil carbon, but that's not true if it was previously forest. If you remove a forest to grow turf, that is not net sequestration.
Yeah.
It's very different than if you're taking cropland, which is already degraded in terms of its organic matter content, because that's what agriculture does, is it does reduce organic matter content. So converting that system into perennial turf, irrigated, fertilized perennial turf, that will build up soil carbon. We have to think about the other end of the life cycle too. And if you are mechanically removing turf grass, I mean, I'm not putting flex chambers out there, but it makes absolute sense that that carbon is going to be returned to the atmosphere. The organic matter is going to decompose. So these are not black and white issues. We do have to manage water, and turf does require a lot of water. So there's like a carbon water trade-off there. But I think it would be a real shame if a lot of green area, especially in really hot, dry parts of the country, were converted from vegetation to hardscaping.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's one thing that
Which
is
is the
very
trend.
clear to me.
That's the trend we're moving to in a lot of areas. You know, you get into the LA Basin
Right.
and Clark County, Nevada, and some of those areas. What does that do with warming? You know, forget
Right.
set carbon aside for a little while, but you know, warming that environment. You know, I lived in Phoenix for a number of years, and you know, the heat island around the downtown area was real. I
Right.
lived up in
That's right.
in the foothills, and you know, we cooled considerably in the evenings because it was largely still desert landscape. So
That's right.
yeah, it's you can't pick one issue and just focus on it, because like you said, it's a system, and it's a domino effect. If you touch one, you know, you start knocking over all kinds of things. And
Right.
it's hard, I think, not only in our industry but in research to not drill down to one thing and really focus on it, because that's kind of what you're tasked with, is to look at carbon sequestration.
Yeah.
But I like the way you really kind of pull a lot of different challenges and subjects into your research, because I think that's the way it needs to be approached. It's not a one size fits all.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why I really appreciate the invitation to talk about these nuances. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we have a great finding, right?
Yeah.
Turfgrass sequesters carbon at really high rates. And I didn't mention that, but that was a big finding from the review paper, is the rates we're seeing are higher than you would get in cropland systems with adoption to no-till. And that's a practice that is
Really?
Eligible for carbon credits.
Yeah.
And the sequestration rates of a new turfgrass system, those are higher buildup than like adopting cover crops. When I look at big global averages. So
why do you think that is? That's actually surprising to me, just because of, you know, like we touched on earlier, you've got just the raw size of the plant, and then obviously the underground system as well has to be deeper and more developed with a no-till system than with a golf course fairway, for instance. But
it
I'm kind
makes
of hearing
sense
the
to me
opposite.
because turfgrass is perennial.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the difference between having a crop year round without or a crop would be, we're talking mostly annual cropping systems.
Wheat, for instance.
Wheat, or it's most of the carbon market, the carbon credits for agricultural practices right now are focused in the Midwest. So corn and soybeans. So yeah, they're annual crops. And even when you add the cover crop, it's not perfect perennialization. So there's green cover year round, and it's not tilled infrequent disturbance will slow down decomposition in the turf system. Yeah.
Okay, so wrap this up for us. How do we get in the game as an industry? Where do we find out more information? How do we educate ourselves? How do we find out about your research and what we might be able to do to capitalize on what you're saying is a pretty positive story? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think about the importance of urban areas, including golf courses,
Right.
and their greenness for livability, and especially as the climate is warming. And what we can do is grow plants, and that makes cities more livable and it reduces emissions. And the more that that can be done with few inputs, that's the direction we have to move in. That's
Right.
the kind of a really like beautiful vision of our future, of a, you know, a climate change reality that is very sustainable. And,
Yeah.
you know, I want to live in a green town. That sounds great. So, I already think that golf courses are moving in that direction, um, and incorporating like naturalized roughs, right? So some of the criticisms of turf are the lack of biodiversity, but that
Mhm.
can get incorporated around the edges and mean naturalized roughs too means fewer inputs. Um, if those areas have less fertilization or maybe aren't irrigated. So
Sure.
yeah, I think folks are already working in this arena and maybe it just needs to be elevated a little bit,
Or
and that's what
communicated.
you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We should have you involved with some first green activities. I got some contacts I'll have to share with you, but I think that's another bridge that you could help us with, and it's been really a positive step for the community to kind of realize the value of golf within their neighborhoods and their communities. And
Mhm.
we talked a while back about Brian Horgan's work when he was still with the University of Minnesota, and I don't know if he's picked it up since he's gone on to Michigan State, but he did this urban study, you know, the value of green space within an urban community, and you know, it's so much bigger than just some old guy swinging a golf club. It's habitat, it's green space, it's cooling, it's all these things. I think
That's right.
some of the stuff he did was just really, really valuable, but we don't toot our horns about this stuff enough. So thanks for encouraging us. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. And I think there's lots more to be done on this, but we really appreciate the fact that you've dipped your toe in the world of turf management and been able to kind of see that we're trying. we're, we're definitely trying to do the right thing. And I think there's a lot of pretty passionate people in our industry, and you know, all of your research and the stuff that you've pulled together has been really helpful. So thank you, Claire. I appreciate the
Yeah, it's
time.
been
And
a pleasure, Kevin.
yeah,
Thank you.
I think there might be another one of these in the future as we learn a little bit more. But thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for joining the podcast, everybody. We're coming up on our 200th episode pretty soon, and we're pretty excited about that. We got some cool stuff in mind, but if you haven't subscribed, make sure to do so. And Claire Phillips, thank you so much for joining us this week. And we will talk again soon, I'm sure.
All right. Thank you. Take care.